Soap. Under the British Empire, it was never just soap. It was moral purification, racial hierarchy, and industrial capitalism, all compressed into a small scented bar. Colonialism didn't only arrive with railways, courts, and armies. It arrived with soap, and lots of it. Not simply to clean bodies, but to scrub cultures, habits, and identities into something the empire found acceptable. In the 19th century, British imperial ideology rested on what was called the civilizing mission, the belief that European rule existed to uplift and morally improve the peoples of Africa, Asia, Australia, and the Americas. Now, this idea is often associated with the phrase the white man's burden, and the phrase comes from a poem written by Rudyard Kipling in 1899. He was a British poet who was deeply shaped by empire. And in the poem, Kipling urged Europeans to take up colonial rule not as conquest but as sacrifice. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. The message was clear. Colonialism wasn't just about profit or domination, it was charity. You weren't invading, you were uplifting. See, and that framing mattered because it allowed empire to present itself as purification. Colonized societies were described as dirty, backward, diseased, or morally polluted. And European rule, by contrast, was imagined as cleansing. So this is where soap enters the story. And one of the most infamous examples comes from Pear's soap. Founded earlier in the 19th century and later absorbed into Britain's expanding commercial empires, Pear's became a pioneer of modern advertising and of racial propaganda. In 1899, Pear's produced an ad that explicitly referenced Kipling's. It showed a racialized before and after image, a dark-skinned child transformed into a white child through washing. The implication was unmistakable. Cleanliness produced whiteness, and whiteness produced civilization. Another Pear's ad makes the logic even clearer. At the center, you see a white imperial officer in a spotless white uniform, calmly washing his hands. You see a bar of soap. And in the panel below, you see a person of color looking upward. And surrounding them are ships, cargo crates, stamped Pear's, and scenes of imperial expansion. And across the bottom runs the slogan, "The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness." So soap here is not symbolic, it is ideological. The white body is elevated, central, and pristine, and the colored body is subordinate, exposed, and framed as needing instruction. So this was the visual grammar of empire. And the white man's burden framed imperial domination as moral duty. It became the language used to excuse land theft, labor exploitation, and racial violence. Soap advertising helped make this worldview feel normal, domestic, even virtuous. But here's the irony. While Britain was busy scrubbing colonized bodies into civilization, Britain itself was filthy. In 1858, the River Thames became so overwhelmed with untreated sewage that the smell was unbearable, and the event became known as the Great Stink. The order was so intense that Parliament suspended sessions because lawmakers could not function inside the building. This was the empire selling cleanliness as salvation, while its own capital reeked of waste. And bathing itself was still viewed with suspicion. In much of Europe in the early modern times, elites often avoided frequent washing and they relied instead on linen changes and perfume. Versailles was notorious for its smells, despite its grandeur, and yet Europe positioned itself as the global authority on hygiene. This contradiction reflects Eurocentrism, the belief that European standards were not just merely different but inherently superior. Through the colonial gaze, colonized people were not seen as individuals. They were measured, judged, and reshaped into European assumption. Cleanliness became a cultural verdict. And soap, however, was not only about race and morality, it was also about resources. Industrial soap depended on palm oil, coconut oil, and cheap labor. Britain extracted vast quantities of palm oil from West Africa, especially Nigeria. Belgium did the same in the Congo. Land was seized, labor coerced, and violence normalized so soap could foam efficiently in European factories. Companies like Lever Brothers built global empires on this extraction. In 1929, Lever Brothers merged with a Dutch company, Margarine Unie, to form Unilever, a multinational giant united by colonial supply chains. While African workers harvested raw materials under brutal conditions, advertising offices in London produced images of white saviors washing away native darkness. This imperial logic spread across the empire. In Kenya, missionary schools required children to wash daily, cut their hair, and adopt European dress. Cleanliness as discipline. In Jamaica, respectability for girls meant church attendance, proper manners, and Lever Brothers soap. In British Malaya, colonial doctors framed hygiene as a way to create civilized workers, while ignoring the plantation conditions that caused the diseases. In South Africa, white settlers labeled black townships filthy while enforcing the segregation that produced those very conditions. In Australia, Aboriginal children were taken from their families and were taught to scrub, rinse, and assimilate soap as a step towards whitening. Everywhere the British Empire planted a flag, it distributed soap. Not because it cared about germs, but because it wanted bodies that looked, smelled, and behaved the way empire demanded. Missionary schools reinforced the message: cleanliness is next to godliness. British cleanliness, Christian morality, and civilization were all folded into one. After formal empire ended, the soap remained. Multinational corporations like Unilever and Palmolive continued to sell hygiene as progress. The language shifted from civilization to development, but the assumptions lingered. Fairer skin was marketed as refined. Western brands were framed as trustworthy and modern. And in post-colonial India, products like Fair and Lovely transformed colonial color hierarchies into consumer aspiration. In Africa, Unilever dominated the markets that were built during empire. And after World War II, American companies reframe soap not as empire but as modernity. Clean skin became economic progress. Same logic, new script. So ask yourself, who really needed cleaning? The farmers of Bengal or the factories of Manchester? The children of Lagos or the boardrooms of London? Soap didn't civilize anyone. It simply sanitized the story of empire. It scrubbed away violence, polished domination, and perfumed power. Because when you call it hygiene, you don't have to call it colonialism. And the next time you pick up a bar of soap, ask not just what it cleans, but what it covers.